Good evening. Hey, kids all over the world get climate change propaganda from their teachers, their peers, and the media. Where can they learn the truth? Well, a good friend of mine is Tom Harris of the International Climate Science Coalition, and he will be my guest on our live stream this evening. We're discussing a new series of 1 or 2 minute long videos that they are producing that are great for all ages, and that includes for young people, kids, students. So stick with us and invite your friends to join us and comment as we go, as we do the From the Stacks program for tonight. Well, again, welcome to From the Stacks. If it looks like I'm not in my usual location, that's because I'm not in my usual location. About an hour and a half, 2 hours ago, we heard a sudden, magnificent burst of thunder, and instantaneously all the lights went off, and several different transformers all got knocked out real near us all at once. So I am now at the home of my good friend John Hodges, who is the director of the Center for Western Studies in Memphis, Tennessee, and John's going to be our guest in a few weeks in early June. But meanwhile, he's made it possible for me to use his office and his computer for tonight's program. We welcome you to this, and I would invite you to post comments on Facebook or YouTube as the program goes along. And as much as possible, we will try to respond to those as they come in. I also wanted to mention to you that during the month of May here, we have a special study, a special resource that we would like to give as our way of saying thanks when people make a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance. This is Fix America's Forests. Reforms to restore national forests and tackle the wildfire crisis. This comes from the Property and Economy Research Center, friends of ours over there, and we're delighted to have the authors of that as our guests in a future program this month. But this is a great study on why we've seen the great tremendous wildfires in the last few years, and answering the question of whether this is a matter of climate change or something else. So I would encourage you to come to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, just write in Fix America's Forests and promo code 21-05. That's Fix America's Forests and promo code 21-05. I would encourage you, by the way, this month to do that early on. Our supply of those is a little more limited than we usually have on these offers, and so you want to get in there while we still have them available. Excuse me. As I said earlier, our guest this evening is Tom Harris. He is with the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and the ICSC Canada has begun producing 1 or 2 minute long videos called Climate Change Minute, and they are excellent little brief educational tools suitable for all ages, but particularly I have in mind how useful they could be for very young people, middle school on up. I think they would be perfectly suitable for. And to me, that's especially important because so many kids get climate change propaganda all the time from their teachers, not just in, say, science class, where you might expect that, but in history classes, social studies classes, gym class, and on and on. And so I'm particularly glad to be able to refer people to this series. We're actually going to see some selections from that series this evening. So, Tom Harris, welcome to tonight's From the Stacks. Thank you so much for being our guest. Tell us a little bit about the International Climate Science Coalition and what it does, and is it part of some larger organization? When and why did it start? What's its history, and who are some of the major leaders in its mission?
Sure. And well, nice to be on with you. Great to be on with you. Also, the International Climate Science Coalition was founded in 2007 by the New Zealand Climate Science Coalition, Terry Dunleavy. They wanted to have an international group, a nonpartisan science-based group that would represent them at international events. And they brought me on in 2008 as executive director. But over the years, what we found is that in Canada, the message that the climate science was simply not backing up the scare, that really wasn't selling very well. You know, the education of the public about science wasn't really working. So we realized that we needed to do something a little different. So we had a contractor who's a specialist in politics actually look at the circumstance, and he actually did a study for another group, but we're using, you know, the results of that study. And what they found were two things. One is that if you question the science in Canada, you end up being declared as a denier, which is, of course, ridiculous because we never deny climate change. It changes all the time, or we'd be under 2 kilometers of ice right now where I'm sitting. The other thing that they found was that it was direct lobbying with government and senior policymakers that would be most effective. So we started a new group, actually. We're still running ICSC, but we're running one that's focused on the situation in Canada, which tends to be a little bit different from the rest of the world. So ICSC Canada was incorporated earlier this year as a not-for-profit organization, which is going to do two things. We're going to focus on trying to shift people's minds from focusing on trying to stop climate change, mitigation, which is, of course, impossible, to trying to adapt to whatever changes happen next, which makes sense because societies who did not adapt to severe climate change are no longer with us. I mean, the Greenland Vikings are an example. You know, it was warm during the medieval warm period when they settled Greenland, but shortly afterwards, around 1300, 1350, it started to return to its normal, very cold conditions, and their settlements simply died out. So that's the first thing. We're focusing on adaptation to climate change, which is a much more effective and less expensive approach than trying to falsely stop climate change. The other thing is that we're going to be talking to policymakers directly. And this is something that might interest you, Cal. The question that was posed by some researchers at Drexel University, University of Ohio, or Ohio State, I should say, and McGill University, is what were the primary drivers of public opinion in climate change? And what they found was that when the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, both agreed that there was a climate crisis, you know, during the time of John McCain, for example, then public support for extreme climate action was very strong. But when there was a divergence of opinion, public support went way down. So it was clear that it was the elites in society, what they were stating, the politicians, that actually drove public opinion. So that's why we're going to meet directly with the policymakers and explain to them why adaptation to climate change makes a lot more sense than trying to stop something that we almost certainly don't control.
Excellent, thank you. Now, before we move on and actually start looking at some of your new videos, I did want to ask you, what's your funding source? You know, are you in the pocket of big oil? Have you got your check from ExxonMobil or the Koch brothers? Or
No, I'd love it if we were. In fact, it's funny, Professor Patterson, who works with us quite often, when he's accused of that, he says, where do I apply? You know, because obviously it would help balance the playing field. It would level the playing field a little bit if we had that kind of money. But, you know, the funding for the alarmist side is literally 2 orders of magnitude, 100 times more than the funding on our side. So we have to be very nimble. We have to actually figure out strategic advantages through messaging and through things like the Climate Change Minute. So yeah, and you know, one of the points we make to all of our donors is that they cannot tell us what messages to have. And so if, for example, we were funded in the future by an oil company, and we aren't currently, but if we were, in fact, we never have been, but if we were, that would be because of our message. So in a way, they're getting cause and effect backwards. It's not that we give this message because of our funders. We may in the future get funding from the oil sector because of our message, but they don't influence what the leading experts say, that's for sure.
Yeah, we get the same kind of accusation all the time at the Cornwall Alliance, and my response is pretty much the way you just responded. Gee, show me where I go to get that money. It would be so nice to have that kind of a, but we don't, and instead we're supported just by the donations of private individuals, and that's the way it goes. But yeah, too, I mean, I've always been puzzled. Why are people so uptight about that kind of a question? I mean, if I have a message that I firmly believe and somebody else says, gee, I like that message too. I'd like to buy him a megaphone so that he can get that out better. He's a good spokesman for it. What's wrong with my accepting that? And what's wrong with their giving that? It seems to me that makes just simple sense.
Yeah.
So let's move on now. As we've mentioned, the ICSC has begun a series of these brief videos called Climate Change Minute. When did you decide and why to produce these? And what age groups really are these suitable for?
Well, I'd say they're suitable for 10-year-olds and up, quite frankly. I mean, some of them are more complicated than others. The one we have on the web right now, because we put a new one on every 2 days, the one we have now is focused on geoengineering, which is, you know, purposely brightening clouds, for example, to reflect sunlight away from the Earth to supposedly cool the planet. Of course, that's an extremely dangerous thing to do, because if we're going into global cooling, which some scientists actually think we are, then artificially cooling the planet could trigger the next little ice age. So that's the last thing we want to do. You know, to me, Cal, the whole concept of geoengineering, trying to engineer the planet to have a certain future climate, not only does it kind of assume that we can decide what that climate should be, but we know so little about the climate system. It's a little like giving a 4-year-old a tool set, taking the back off your computer and saying, here, fix my computer.
Yeah.
It's more likely they'll electrocute themselves. And similarly, trying to geoengineer a planet when we don't understand much of the underlying physics is very, very dangerous. So yeah, I'd say anything age 10 and above.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I have watched a good many of them, and I think you're right. Age 10 and up can handle this really well. We recently ran an article by a high school senior who talked about how his American history teacher had taken time in class to tell the students how dangerous man-made global warming is. And this was not in a science class, it was not in a biology class, anything like that. American history. So really, young people need additional sources of information. And I think these climate change minutes are a great answer to that need. We intend to help you to get them out to wider audiences through the Cornwall Alliance as well. We're going to start that right now, tonight, with this program. And let's go ahead and see the very first ever Climate Change Minute.
Hello, I'm Tom Harris with today's Climate Change Minute. Canada's government declared a climate emergency in June 2019. Also, 384 local jurisdictions across the country have declared a climate emergency as well. Internationally, 1,800 governments in 33 countries have done the same. Yet none have done so in the parts of the world that are supposedly most at risk to climate change, namely in Africa and most of Asia. They understand that climate change is natural and current trends are anything but an emergency. After all, the supposed global average temperature has risen only slightly more than 1 degree Celsius since 1880. Sea level continues its gradual rise at about 7 inches per century. Extreme weather records are being set less frequently, and polar bears are thriving. Even if our leaders don't understand this, developing nations know that they have far more significant issues to handle than climate change. To learn more about this and other topics in climate change, please visit icsc-canada.com.
Yeah, so quick, clear, simple, real handsome speaker there for these. And now there you point out that though thousands of national and local governments around the world have declared a climate emergency, all of these are in developed countries, not in Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world that still are very, very poor and that are said to be the most at risk from climate change. You give some of the reasons why such countries don't latch onto this. I'd like to know if you have some other reasons, and I'd like to just start this off by asserting one thought of my own, and that is that, frankly, I think poverty is a far greater risk to human beings than anything related to climate. Even people with, say, the bottom 10% of income in the United States could thrive anywhere from the Arctic Circle to the Sahara Desert to the Amazon rainforest. But people living on the equivalent of, say, $1.75 a day, they can't thrive in the best tropical paradise. And so, you're in a very, very poor country. Economic development is a whole lot more important to you than fighting climate change.
Yeah, actually, the 2 points. One is that the UN did a poll called the My World poll, in which they asked a total of 9 million people across the world in many countries what their top priorities were, and the UN gave them a list to choose from. And they put climate change as absolutely the top one in the choice. And of course, the UN says it's the greatest threat to humanity. Now, after 9 million people have voted, climate change ranks dead last, okay, out of these 17 or so causes. So you're right. People in developing countries, they know that education and peace and good drinking water and electricity and things like that, those are infinitely more important. And it is interesting that in that poll, the only countries that were rating climate change, even in the top 5, were wealthy countries who'd already solved those basic things. The other point I wanted to make, Cal, is that when I went to the climate conference in Copenhagen in 2009, the UN climate conference, it was really interesting because the Africans there were really appalled at the focus of the meeting. The focus of the meeting was stopping climate change that might happen decades in the future. The Africans said this to me, and I thought it was very revealing. They said, you people are worried about what might happen 50 years in the future. My people need help today, like building wells and moving populations out of areas that are changing naturally to become deserts. And the poverty that they experience, the lack of energy, 1 billion people approximately around the world have no electricity. I mean, those kinds of numbers are far, far more significant. And, so the Africans themselves were saying that the climate scare got its focus backwards because, in fact, of the over $1 billion a day that goes to climate finance around the world, only 1/20th of it goes to helping real people now through adaptation. And this is why we think that the focus of our new group, focusing on adaptation, should have a lot of currency. The expert who actually did the study did focus groups, and he found that people from across the political spectrum, left, right, and center, they all supported adaptation. So that's why we're focusing on it, because hopefully we can start to bring in people from the center and even some on the left that, you let people suffer today due to poverty and lack of energy and lack of good water, because you're focused on what might happen in 50 years. I mean, that's immoral, basically.
Yeah, excellent. I'm so totally with you. And that's been a major focus of Cornwall Alliance's work for, ever since we got started in 2005. We do have our first comment on, this one is on Facebook. This comes from Guy Takamatsu. He writes, and I think this is particularly perceptive. says those who want to adapt to climate change want to raise the bridge, while those who want to change the climate are like those who want to lower the bridge. And then he points out, by the way, that that back in well, long time ago anyway, that was the title of a movie starring Jerry Lewis, Don't Raise the Bridge, Lower the River.
Well, that's what they're trying to do.
With Jerry Lewis, that it had to be a comedy.
Yeah, exactly. Well, in fact, we're thinking, Jay Lear and I were discussing this the other day. I mean, how long is it before people's reaction to many of the extreme statements from politicians and activists is simply laughter? I mean, the whole concept of humans affecting the climate more than the sun, for example, I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. It's really, it's like a child who thinks that if they wave their arms, they can make the wind go faster. You know, I mean, this self-centeredness that we are the center of the universe, we cause everything to happen. This is something that most people outgrow, but apparently the environmentalists haven't outgrown it.
Exactly. Well, your March 17 show was titled, and you've already referred to this earlier, Polar Bears Are Thriving. So let's watch a brief bit of that one and then come back and discuss that a little bit.
Climate activists say that the polar bear is at risk due to climate change. This makes no sense. The bears are generally healthy throughout their range and reproducing well. According to zoologist Dr. Susan Crockford, polar bears number about 30,000 today, 3 times as many as in the 1960s. It turns out that the polar bear was designated at risk not because of real-world observations, but because of theoretical model forecasts of the future. In fact, the polar bear was the first species to be designated simply due to model forecasts. Yet polar bear biologists originally forecast that if sea ice retreated to the level it is actually at today, only 1/3 of the population would remain. Clearly, their models do not work. The polar bear is thriving. To learn more about this and other topics in climate change, please visit icsc-canada.com.
So, there, Tom, you said that climate alarmists, depending on computer models rather than real-world observations, predicted that if Arctic sea ice extent declined from then to what it actually is today, the polar bear population would fall to just about 1/3 of what it had been. Instead, as Susan Crockford documents in her book, The Polar Bear Catastrophe That Never Happened, which is available, by the way, through the Cornwall Alliance's online store, cornwallalliance.org/shop. The polar bear population has grown to 3 times what it was in the 1960s, and polar bears are clearly not threatened with extinction. So, 2 questions for you about this. First, how do you describe to children, young people, say 10 years old and up, the difference between models and observations and why that's important?
Yeah, sure. Well, the main idea behind models is that scientists try to forecast what's going to happen in the future based on their understanding of how they think nature is operating now. And in many cases, such as in the polar bear, they don't properly understand how the polar bear survives. And so they actually base their models on things that are not real. You know, it's interesting because many people think that as the ice retreats, that polar bears will starve. But in fact, it's the exact opposite. As the ice advances, it becomes so thick that the ring seal and the other food for the polar bears can no longer break through the ice. So they move to much greater extent. They move way out of that region to areas where the ice is thin or no ice at all. And so that is when polar bears starve. And indeed, if you look at the recent record, it's during the cold periods when the ice was thicker that they had significant problems with polar bears starving. And you know, Cal, one thing to point out to children is that if polar bears were so fragile, and remember, this is the largest land-based carnivore, they're very dangerous. I mean, they're bigger, much bigger than, you know, a cow or things like that. But regardless, if they actually sorry, the buffalo is bigger than the cow. The polar bear is big, though. I mean, we're talking about many hundreds of pounds. But regardless, if the polar bear was so threatened by thin ice, then what happened in the medieval warm period when, of course, ice would have been much less because it was warmer than today? Or the warmest period since the last glacial was called the Holocene Optimum, which was about 8,000 years ago. And so Professor Carter, who passed away, unfortunately, recently, he used to show pictures of polar bears on ice. And he'd say, well, you know, children, this must be a virtual reality picture. Because if, in fact, the polar bear was so fragile that they would die with the kind of ice levels that we have now and have forecast for the next century, then they would have died out many, many times in the past. They wouldn't even be here anymore because they evolved tens of thousands of years ago. I mean, this is not a recent species that suddenly appeared in the 20th century. They lived through much warmer periods in the past when ice would have been much less, and they would have had to live largely on land. So they're very adaptable. And, you know, that's the thing I would explain to children, is that you can't really rely on models until you properly understand the science. And we just don't understand the science in many of these cases. We're learning every day, and someday maybe we can make forecasts, but for now, there's no chance.
Yeah. Okay, and then my second question related to this is, okay, so why do you think climate alarmists like Al Gore and frankly lots of others made such a big deal of polar bears when the actual empirical evidence was so contrary to their claims? The idea that they were threatened with extinction was just based on no real observational evidence at all. Why would they do this? Why would they choose polar bears in particular?
Well, I think it's because of the general conception that polar bears are these sort of cuddly animals. You know, their baby bears are certainly very cute. And also they're a long, long way away from us. So we really, most people don't have any way to check the actual status of the polar bear. And it's interesting because when the native people went down to Washington during the hearings about whether it should be declared endangered, and these are people who live right there, they were saying, well, no, there's no danger to them. So I think it's very much like out of Patrick Moore's book about invisible catastrophes, things that you personally can't check. I mean, if you were to say that, you know, rabbits are in danger and people say, well, I see rabbits all around me, what are you talking about? That wouldn't be a good target. So I think they choose things that are hard for us to check.
Yeah, and things that, you know, that are portrayed as cuddly and sweet. You know, I mean, photogenic megafauna is sort of the term for that. You know, they look good on camera. The problem is that, you know, the polar bears will eat you rather quickly if you invade their territory. All right, so now on March 26, you ran a climate change minute called Carbon Dioxide is Not Pollution.
Activists, politicians, and media across the political spectrum tell us that we must reduce our carbon pollution to save the planet. This makes no sense. Not only is the planet in no danger due to rising emissions, but the gas they're talking about, carbon dioxide or CO2, is anything but pollution. CO2 is a colorless, odorless gas without which there'd be no life on Earth. It's as essential to plant photosynthesis as is sunlight and water. That's why commercial greenhouses routinely operate at up to 4 times the CO2 concentration in the outside atmosphere. At these high levels, plants grow more efficiently and require less water.
All right, so early on in that, you referred to, quote, carbon emissions, unquote. But what you were really talking about is not just carbon, but carbon dioxide. So what's the difference, and why is that important in the public conversation, the public controversy about regulating carbon dioxide?
Well, I think if the alarmists were to use the term carbon dioxide, most people would remember their grade school science classes that carbon dioxide is plant food. So instead they call it carbon, which you generally think of as something like soot. Okay, soot is carbon, no question about it. It's actually a complex mixed up form of carbon. Carbon is also things like diamonds and and other compounds. But the bottom line is that carbon, in fact, is the stuff of life. If carbon were pollution, if carbon dioxide were pollution, then when we put on a mask, where it increases our CO2 because we're keeping some of the air there, or when we wear a snorkel, when we're actually swimming, where we'd have a greater CO2, then we'd be poisoning ourselves. Now, I'm not a fan of wearing masks, but at the same time, I don't really fear that I'm going to poison myself. I mean, if you're in a crowded conference room, you can have 900 or 1,000 parts per million in comparison with 415 in the outside atmosphere. So indeed, it's really a trick right out of 1984. You remember in the appendix, they had something called Newspeak, where they would actually try to change the thinking pattern of the population to the way the government wanted by using certain language. And that's what they do constantly throughout the climate debate. Carbon pollution. It's not pollution. It's not carbon. Carbon is a solid, or in the case of soot, small particles. And things like, green energy. I always laugh at that because they say green energy is low CO2 energy. But actually, you want more CO2. Craig Idso shows that as CO2 has risen, and he's done tests in greenhouses, you have more plant growth, and you can actually grow plants with less water. So, this is all part of the newspeak that they use in the climate debate.
Right. Yeah. I mean, carbon dioxide has been non-toxic at levels 20 times the present atmospheric concentration. And so I think the climate alarmists really just use the term carbon instead for the scare effect. They're really not being honest with us when they do that. Here's a bit more of that same video where you make another point.
We're actually near the lowest level of CO2 in Earth's history. 440 million years ago, CO2 was over 1,000% of today's level, while the Earth was in one of the coldest periods in the record. Clearly, CO2 does not drive higher temperatures.
So, there you point out that sometimes in Earth's past, CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere were 10 times what they are today. Yet, global temperature was much lower than today. And you reason that therefore CO2 doesn't drive global temperature. Are you, Tom, challenging the idea that CO2 is a so-called greenhouse gas, an infrared absorbing gas, radiating out, absorbing some infrared heat, radiating out towards space, and then sending some of it back toward Earth's surface? Are you challenging that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because at first glance, people would think that the more CO2 you put in the atmosphere, the temperature is going to continue to rise and rise and rise. But it doesn't actually work that way. If you go from 0 parts per million to, let's say, 100, and remember, we're now at 415, then yes, you'll see significant temperature rise. But as the CO2 level increases, the amount of temperature rise actually drops off until when you get to our level of CO2, increases in CO2 actually cause very, very little change, okay? And many other factors then overwhelm CO2. So indeed, it's a little bit like painting a window black. The first coat of black paint takes out a lot of the light. But as you put more and more coats of black paint, eventually it really doesn't have much impact. And what they call that is they call that saturation. When the atmosphere gets saturated with carbon dioxide, then the more and more CO2 you add has virtually no impact on temperature. And that is actually a logarithmic relationship where CO2 impact, it increases a lot at the beginning and then just tapers off until eventually it's having essentially no impact. So as you go beyond our current levels, the temperature rise is very, very small as a result of CO2, and other factors, in particular the sun, massively overwhelm the small impact that CO2 then has on higher levels in the atmosphere.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that I think the alarmists will do is they'll try to misrepresent people like you as saying, well, carbon dioxide has nothing to do with global temperature. You're not saying that. What you are saying is, yeah, it does, but its effect diminishes over time as the amount of it rises and you reach a saturation point. Window painting analogy, I think, is very instructive on that. We do have another comment here, this one from David Puffert, who says, when I was much younger in the 1960s, there was speculation that it would someday be possible to control the weather. There would not be weather forecasts, there would be weather elections. How are we getting bent out of shape now about climate when we know we can't handle weather? I think that kind of points to the fact that, hey, if climate is average weather over a period of 30 years or more, and we can't even control the next day's weather, how do we think that we can control the next century's climate?
Yeah, and it's even worse than that because we can't even forecast weather beyond a few days with any kind of accuracy. So, I mean, to even be able to forecast it, let alone control future climate, I mean, I find it more and more when I ask scientists, is it even going to be hotter or colder 50 years from now? They'll say something like, well, ask me in 50 years. I mean, the fact is, it's not just a matter of not being able to control climate change. We can't even forecast what the natural climate change is going to do without us. And that's why this geoengineering is so dangerous. I mean, if you purposely cool a planet that, who knows, may be headed for global cooling, according to various experts who study the sun, then the last thing you're going to do is trip it into even more cooling. So until we fully understand this system, we don't want to give the 4-year-old tools to try and fix our computer.
Exactly, right. Well, again, I would remind our viewers that we are glad to see your comments as they come up on Facebook or YouTube. And as much as we're able, we'll try to address those during the program tonight. I also would remind you that during the month of May, as our way of saying thank you, when you make any 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size, we would be glad to send you this wonderful new study, Fix America's Forests, Reforms to Restore National Forests and Tackle the Wildfire Crisis. This is a wonderful 40-page study, very well documented, very clearly written, that shows that the solution to the wildfire crisis has nothing to do with fighting climate change, but it has everything to do with revising forest management policy. So we'd like to send this to you. To request your copy, simply go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in there, Fix Our Nation's Forests, and promo code 21-05, and we'll be delighted to send this to you. As I mentioned earlier, we have a bit fewer of these this month than we usually do, so I'd encourage you to act quickly so that you can receive your copy. All right, so now, Tom, one of the most common claims by climate alarmists is that 97% of all scientists agree that global warming is real, that it's man-made, and that it's catastrophic, and that we must spend trillions of dollars trying to reduce it. You challenge that in your March 29 Climate Change Minute called No Climate Change Consensus. Let's take a quick look at that.
We are told that 97% of scientists say that human activity is causing dangerous global warming. But the studies activists use to support this argument are flawed. They either don't ask the right questions or don't ask the right people. The right question is, are our greenhouse gas emissions causing dangerous climate change? The right people to ask are scientists who research the causes of climate change. The science organizations which have released statements supporting the climate scare have not shown that even a majority of their own members support the organization's statements.
Okay, so you say that the right question to ask is, are our greenhouse gas emissions causing dangerous climate change? Now, when that's the question, the consensus disappears. So, what are the questions that the backers of this 97% consensus claim are asking, and what's wrong with those questions?
Yeah, they ask questions that are kind of self-evident. I mean, for example, 2009, Zimmerman and Doran is often cited by climate alarmists. But if you actually look at the question they asked, is global warming occurring and are humans a significant contributing factor? But you know, that is not the significant question. I mean, the fact that the Earth might have warmed, well, it did warm about just over a degree Celsius since 1880, that's actually been a good thing because we were coming out of the Little Ice Age. But the other factor is humans are, well, let's say humans caused all of that warming. Like, so what? It has to be dangerous warming that is primarily caused by humans that we could otherwise stop. Because one of the big problems right now is across the world, as I say, we're spending $1 billion+ a day on climate finance. And most of that is going to things like wind and solar power, to renewable energy, which, by the way, renewable energy, it's not a clean energy source. If you actually look at the source of wind and solar power, they are indeed probably the dirtiest energy sources on the planet. And I say that again, wind and solar are probably the dirtiest energy sources on the planet when you consider how they're made. But regardless, the consensus issue, first of all, consensus, science is not decided by a show of hands. And a funny story, which is actually a true story, is interesting because after Albert Einstein published his theory of relativity, the Germans were, some of them were very anti-Semitic, and they were also very much opposed to his ideas. So they actually wrote a book entitled 100 Scientists Against Einstein. It was in German, of course, but that's the approximate translation. And when they asked Einstein about it, he said, 100? Well, one would be enough if he was right. And, the fact is, consensus does not decide science. Otherwise, the Earth would still be the center of the universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't have continental drift. Otherwise, they wouldn't wash their hands when they go from the morgue to an operating room, okay? So these consensus ideas were wrong. So even if they did show a consensus, and as I say, they don't show a meaningful consensus, but even if they did, that would not be proof of anything whatsoever.
Yeah, you also say that the right people to ask are scientists who research the causes of climate change. Now, that seems obvious to me, but what other sorts of scientists are the alarmists actually asking, and what's wrong with that? Are you saying that they're not really scientists, or what?
No. In fact, it's interesting. A friend of mine is a bark beetle biologist, okay? And she signed an open letter along with a number of other experts in, climate change effects. And of course, she's very good at understanding how climate change affects her bark beetles. She signed a letter to Stephen Harper, who was our prime minister then, in which she talked about how it was crucially important that we stop climate change, that kind of message. So I was at a party and I asked her, I said, well, have you ever studied the causes of climate change? And she said, well, no, not really. I said, well, then why are you sending a letter to the prime minister, actually pushing an idea about the causes of climate change when you only study the impacts? And she said, well, I'm a junior professor and everybody else was signing it. And so I won't use her name because she's a very, very nice person. But I think a lot of this goes along to, the bandwagon effect. It's one of those things that, drives public opinion in many things, is that they think, well, many people agree, so it must be true. So they don't have to actually research it and think about it themselves. But here was a lady who was a pure expert, very good in biology at the causes or the impacts of climate change. But she was signing a letter to our prime minister talking about the causes. So many of them, like David Suzuki, he's a great example. Suzuki is a fruit fly geneticist. And yet for Canada, he's the leading spokesperson on behalf of climate alarmism. I mean, he has had his own TV show. He's been, many accolades have been dumped on him. He's a Japanese Canadian who did very, very well. But the bottom line is that he doesn't have any study or any actual expertise in the causes of climate change. It's people like Tim Patterson, for example, from Carleton, who actually study how the sun has driven climate change in the past with an effort to try to understand what's going to happen in the future. I mean, those are the kinds of people who look at the causes of climate change. And so they're the ones that should be asked. And, in general, you find that they are only a subset, a small group that are asked when these big surveys are produced.
Yeah, probably the most famous study used to support the 97% claim is one by John Cook out of, I've forgotten now, the university in Australia. And as one psychology professor, PhD, in Arizona pointed out in a series of critiques of this, the vast majority of the scientists whose opinion on the causes of climate change drawn on by Cook in his study to support the 97% idea were not climate scientists. They weren't meteorologists, they weren't climatologists, they weren't oceanographers, they weren't geologists, they weren't, atmospheric physicists or chemists. They were, many of them were psychologists. Many of them were biologists focusing on things that were entirely unrelated to the causes of climate change. But if they mentioned climate change, if they mentioned global warming in their papers, in the abstracts of their papers, in a way that indicated that they thought it was real and that humans might have something to do with it, then they were added into the consensus. This, of course, is a complete abuse of authority. Now, contrary to that consensus claim, you cite some other scientists in another of your climate change minutes.
Yeah, exactly. There are, however, many reports that oppose the climate alarm. Take the Oregon Petition, for example. It has been signed by over 9,000 relevant PhDs. The petition says, there is no convincing scientific evidence the human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate system.
So does the Oregon Petition, which people can read along with the names of all 31,000 plus signers at www.petitionproject.org, does the Oregon Petition deny that greenhouse gas emissions could be contributing to some increase in global temperature?
No, they focus on the right question. They talk about the fact that there is no evidence that there is dangerous climate change being caused by our CO2 emissions. And in fact, they focus on the fact that it's actually positive in so many ways. I mean, there are agricultural experts who hope that CO2 continues to rise so that we can continue to actually feed our growing population. And Cal, I'd like to point out one document here that your readers or your viewers may want to look at. It's called the Non-Governmental International Panel on Climate Change, the Biological Impacts Report. And as you can see, it's huge. And there are thousands of scientific references in leading journals across the world which talk about the positive impacts of increasing carbon dioxide. And that is just one of the many books put out by this group. Here's another one talking about the science that shows the science is certainly anything but settled. And this last one, which they put out most recently, another huge one with thousands of references, talks about the fact that the climate change we're experiencing is, generally beneficial, and we should continue to use fossil fuels specifically because it increases our prosperity and actually increases our ability to protect the environment. Okay, so those documents, three of them together, there must be 10,000 references of leading experts across the world that throw the whole climate scare in the garbage.
Yeah, those would make great bedtime reading. But truly, I mean, I've spent many hours in all three of those volumes, and they are just stunning for the kind of evidence that they bring for this very issue. And one of the things that I like to point out to people is that when we're talking about the impact of climate change, and here really the alarmists ought to be on our side here, because it's their climate models that tell us that as greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere increase, the warming that comes from that is concentrated mainly toward the poles, not toward the equator, mainly in winter, not in summer, mainly at night, not in the daytime. In other words, what's causing an increase in global average surface temperature on an annualized basis is not increases in high temps, it's increases in low temps. And on average, a cold snap kills, I used to always say 10 times as many, and that is cited in some studies from 20 and 30 years ago, 10 times as many people per day as a heat wave. More recently, I just read a study that indicates that no, it's probably more like 20 times as many people die in a day of cold snap as die in a day of heat wave. Now, if we're raising low temperatures and making no significant change in high temperatures, that ought to be all good news, not only because people are not hurt by cold snaps, but also because we're lengthening the growing season. The first freeze comes later in the fall, the last freeze comes earlier in the spring. We're also expanding the arable land farther toward the poles, to higher latitudes and to high altitudes, because the temperatures are more moderate. So all of this is really good news regarding climate change, and it's the exact opposite of what the alarmists are wanting to say. Well, on April 12th,
one point.
Sure.
Can I add just one point to that? And that is the fact that it's the warming that occurs mostly at high latitudes, like in the Arctic, is actually a good thing for another reason. In fact, it's the difference between pressures and temperatures at high and low latitudes that drives extreme weather. So as the Earth warms, if the models are right, then that differential is less and you get less extreme weather. So a warming world is a more tranquil world.
Yeah, I said that way back in 2005, I believe it was, maybe it was 2006, when I was still teaching at a seminary. And I said that, and I was quoted on the news, and some people just went ballistic, saying, "Who is this guy? He's not a climate scientist. This is nonsense." I got a phone call a day later from a guy whom I had never heard of before. And he said, "You don't know me, but my name is Neil Frank, and I am the former director of the National Hurricane Center." And I thought, oh boy, I stuck my foot in it this time. And instead, Neil went on to say, "And I just called to tell you, stick to your guns. You are absolutely right on that. This is exactly what hurricanes do. They move heat from the equator to the poles. And the less difference there is in temperature, the less of that heat needs to be moved. And therefore, we should have fewer and weaker hurricanes with global warming." So I was pretty encouraged by that.
Oh, that's great.
Okay. Now on April 12, Tom, you posted a video called "Prepare for Climate Change, Don't Try to Stop It." Here it is.
Climate alarmists warn us daily of the potentially devastating effects of climate change, yet very little is being done to reduce their impact. Instead, hundreds of billions of dollars are being spent on dubious attempts to control the climate decades in the future. In fact, we are spending 20 times more money trying to stop what is mostly natural climate change than we are on helping today's population prepare for those changes. When it comes to hurricane preparedness, a good example to follow comes from India. Indians along the Bay of Bengal coast need only walk a half kilometer or less to engage in vertical evacuation. Built at 1 kilometer intervals along the coast are multi-story storm shelters designed to house hundreds of people for days at a time if necessary. Other sensible adaptation measures include reinforcing buildings and strengthening infrastructure by building levees and upgrading storm sewers, not to mention helping relocate people living on floodplains or those at risk from tornadoes and hurricanes. These are just a few examples of how we need to harden our society to withstand extreme weather events of all kinds, independent of their causes.
Now that raises the important issue of whether mitigation or adaptation is the better option. Trying to stop climate change or changing our ways so whether the future is warmer or cooler, either way, we're able to adapt, we're able to survive, and indeed to thrive. Why is that such an important issue, Tom?
Well, it's interesting that Christopher Monckton from the United Kingdom did a study in which he showed that there was a 50-to-1 ratio of benefits of adaptation to mitigation. Okay, he wasn't actually questioning the science of climate change at that point, but you hear this constantly throughout the literature, is that the adaptation to climate change, even if you think humans are causing dangerous climate change, the adaptation is an effective, far more influential and important thing to do than trying to stop it. And of course, the idea that we can stop it, even if it were true that humans were causing most of it, the fact is that China has continued to grow very, very quickly. And indeed, they have an out clause, so they never have to reduce emissions. So no matter what we do, the CO2 level in the atmosphere will continue to rise. And as a consequence, whatever climate change is coming no matter what we do. Whether you agree or disagree with the science is immaterial. The thing is, though, it is better by far to simply adapt to climate change. And that is the main message, actually, of ICSC right now, is that, look, we're not going to get into a debate about the science, although, as you know, I think the science is very flawed, but we're not going to push politicians to bring that up. We're going to simply say to them, look, climate is going to change. It always has changed. It always will. And so we better get ready.
Yeah. Well, I hope that our viewers will take the time to watch lots of your climate change minutes. There are 27 of them so far. Among those that we haven't sampled here are increased carbon dioxide could save life, coral reefs not in danger, geoengineering, a dangerous game, and lots more. Now, the last one I'd like to sample tonight is called Logical Fallacies Poisoning Climate Debate. I was particularly attracted to that because I used to teach logic in seminary, and so I love to point out fallacies in people's arguments. Let's take a quick look at a bit of that one.
Hello, I'm Tom Harris with today's Climate Change Minute. The climate debate is crucially important. At stake are billions of dollars, millions of jobs, and if people like Dr. David Suzuki are right, the fate of humanity itself. Consequently, we need all parties in the discussion to behave responsibly. Sadly, the climate debate is now poisoned by ad hominem attacks and other logical fallacies. Suzuki wrote about the problem of personal attacks in the climate debate, but then went on to do the same thing himself, referring to those of us who disagree with him as anti-science shills and climate change deniers. This approach is often used to encourage readers to equate climate skeptics with Holocaust deniers and so discount what they are saying. But making an analogy, even indirectly, between denial of the Holocaust and questioning the causes of climate change is irrational. The former was a horrific event that is part of established history, while the latter concerns one of the most complex sciences ever tackled.
So, alarmists argue fallaciously when they label skeptics as climate change deniers. Some of their other fallacious attacks include claiming that skeptics' conclusions are driven by their funding sources. We talked about that earlier. Or that skeptics are a tiny minority of scientists. We talked about that in terms of the consensus argument. Or that professional associations of scientists all line up on their side. What's wrong with that last argument?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, not a single one of those organizations, and I've even asked them directly in some cases, have shown that a majority of their own members agree with the statements being made by the science organizations. In fact, Archie Robinson, who is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, he only found out about the Royal Society's statement about climate change, supporting alarmism, of course, after it was already publicized in the media. And he called up and he asked them, "What are you doing? I'm a fellow. I didn't even get a chance to give my opinion." And they said, "Well, the head of the Royal Society of Canada just did it because he felt this was the consensus of world opinion." So yeah, in fact, these surveys really don't mean much if the top people in their own group don't even get to give input before they announce that the group supports it.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. As far again, and I've seen studies on this. It's not just as far as I know. It's that none of these professional associations of scientists has actually polled its members to find out what they actually think on the issue. Instead, you have the organizational leaders, the bureaucrats who decide that this is going to be the position of this association. And the members don't really have a say in it. So what sounds like, okay, the National Academies of Science, or the American Physical Society or something like that has jumped on this bandwagon. No, it's not the society. It's a few people in its administrative leadership who have done this. Well,
yeah,
Tom,
in fact, leading experts have actually withdrawn from some of these groups for that reason.
That's right. Yeah. Well, thanks again, Tom, for being with us tonight. It's been a lot of fun. Do you have a closing comment for us?
Yeah, I think that what we need to do is encourage people to have the courage to speak out and ask questions. Why is it a bad thing that the Earth has warmed just over a degree since 1880? I'd rather not live in the Little Ice Age. Why is it a bad thing that CO2 continues to rise when it's plant food? So people have to have the courage to speak out and ask difficult questions.
All right. Thanks again, Tom. And for you out there in the audience, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Would invite you to come again next week when our guest will be James Agresti of justfacts.com to discuss essential facts about COVID-19. I'd also just invite you to learn more about the Cornwall Alliance at cornwallalliance.org. See our many videos at youtube.com/c/Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. And then remind you too that during the month of May, as our special way of saying thank you when you make a 100% tax-deductible donation of literally any size, we will be glad to send you a copy of the new report, Fix Our Nation's Forests, that just does a great job of explaining why the recent spate of really catastrophic wildfires stems not from climate change, but from poor forest management, and how we need to fix that, what we need to do to change things. So if you'd like your copy of that, we'd be glad to send you one. Just to request it, go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, in the comments field, write in Fix America's Forests and promo code 21-05. We'll be glad to send it to you. Thanks again for joining us for tonight's From the Stacks.